Okay, so hey, welcome to Chapter 16 lecture. Today we're going to cover the era of Reconstruction. We're looking at the period from 1865 to 1877. Really, when we look at Reconstruction, what we're looking at is the rebuilding of the South. It's going to happen in two phases. You're going to see presidential Reconstruction roughly from 1865 to 1866, and then a period that's commonly known as radical Reconstruction or congressional Reconstruction, and that's going to take place from 1867 to 1877. Okay, so when we look at presidential Reconstruction, what we're really looking at is we're looking at President Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction of the South. Lincoln never wanted the Civil War, never wanted the South to leave. You know, he gets elected in 1860, and by the time he's inaugurated in 1861, the majority of the South is left, right? And so he's tasked with this job of bringing the country back together. How are we going to fix this country? And he tries to do it peacefully, and then Fort Sumter breaks out, and we have this whole Civil War that takes place, right? And so Lincoln's main idea about the Civil War and about the South leaving is that the South never had a legal right to de-unionize itself, to take itself out of the United States. And so the actions of the South were never really legal. And so therefore they didn't exist. And so Lincoln wants to end the war and bring everybody back into the Union as quickly as possible. Basically sweep the whole thing under the rug and forget about it. All right, but of course we know in history that Lincoln's assassinated in April of 1865, so he never really gets to carry out his plan, right? The textbook talks about his plan being this idea of 10%, where you get 10% of the people that were eligible to vote in the 1860 election. They pledge allegiance to the United States and the Constitution, and then all's forgiven. And everybody's let back in the Union. States are brought back in. The only people that are really held accountable are like high-ranking military officials and high political figures within the Confederacy, right? And then they have to apply for their own special pardons or whatever. But Lincoln is assassinated, and so we never really get to see what Lincoln would have done or how history would have treated Lincoln after the Civil War. Would he have held the high esteem? Would he be held in the same high esteem that he is now, or would his Reconstruction efforts have tarnished his image over time and over history? All right. So Lincoln's assassinated, and his vice president takes over, and it's Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is a Southerner. He's from the state of Tennessee. Was a senator from Tennessee when Tennessee left the Union, and Johnson decided not to leave the Union with his home state, but remain loyal. And so in 1864, the election 1864, Lincoln's looking for a way to kind of send a signal to the South that, hey, when this war's over, and it's rapidly coming to an end in November of 1864, we're willing to let bygones be bygones, and I'm going to bring this a Democrat Southerner who is also a slave owner, onto the presidential ticket from the Republican emancipator, right? So he's going to bring all these people together, right? And so Lincoln has this plan. Of course, we don't know what happens. He gets assassinated. All right, so Johnson takes over and just does not have the personality of Lincoln. Doesn't have the political skill. Doesn't have the personality. I don't know, just the likability of Abraham Lincoln. And so Johnson takes charge, and he pretty well does what Lincoln had laid out, except it just absolutely rubs Congress the wrong way. And you're looking at a radical Congress that's led by this Republican Party. And I think what we miss in history is the fact that Lincoln's really this moderate Republican. He wasn't necessarily for emancipation of the slaves. I mean, he was a Republican, and he was for eventual emancipation. But it takes him several years into the war to actually turn the Civil War into an issue of slavery. And so he's pretty, using the modern political landscape, he's pretty right wing when it comes to this issue of human bondage. And so we get Johnson, and he's trying to follow maybe necessarily in the president's footsteps, and he's just not as skilled. He's dealing with a Congress that's very radical. You look at the textbook; it talks about the Wade Davis bill, in which these two senators were going to require an ironclad oath, in which Southerners were going to have to basically swear on everything that they ever held sacred, that they never took up arms against the country, never took up arms against the United States, never were part of the Confederacy, right? It's just totally, and if they were part of the Confederacy, then they never get to take part in the political process of America again. And so then you're just going to disenfranchise the entire South because of this bill. And so Johnson's looking for ways to bring everybody back together. He feels like that's his job. I got to bring President Johnson's like, look, I got to bring the entire Union back together as quickly and as painlessly as possible, right? And so we're going to deal with this period of presidential Reconstruction from 1865 to 1866. The first thing that's going to take place, even before Lincoln is assassinated, we have the 13th Amendment that is proposed, sent out. It makes it through both branches of Congress. It gets sent out to the states in January of 1865, and it comes back in December of 1865 that the 13th Amendment is passed and slavery is no longer an institution that's allowed in the United States, right? So Johnson takes over this. Johnson's going to take over after the assassination of Lincoln, and we talked about this, right? He's a Southerner, he's a slave owner, he stays in the Union, he's a Democrat. The ironic thing is Johnson is a poor Southerner, and so he doesn't buy into the aristocracy of the South. And when we get into Reconstruction, he kind of almost takes a joy in the fact that there's certain people that have to reach out to him in order to rejoin the Union, and in order to take part of what is America and the promise. And he kind of gets to reshuffle the South a little bit. But Johnson's not looking to radically reshuffle it, where we're going to have African Americans climbing the social ladder. He's looking to maybe kind of push up poor whites up the ladder a little bit. But he's definitely looking to keep whites on top and blacks on the bottom. All right. So Johnson is going to, in May of 1865, he's going to pass the proclamation of amnesty and I can't read my writing. So reconciliation to the South, right? And basically, this is going to pardon all Southerners that took part in the rebellion, except for high-ranking military officers, high-ranking political officials, and then also any member of the Southern society that had a taxable wealth of over $20,000, which doesn't sound like a ton of money in today's time, right? But back then, that is the planters. Those are the higher end people of society, and so like he's really placing the blame of this war. The cost of this war is and the blood of the war is on the hands of the elite, the social elites of the South. And they have to basically write him personal letters and beg for their pardon from the president, right? It's going to return all property to Southerners with the exception of their slaves, right? So that basically does away with this idea that the hope that African Americans had at that point that they were going to be given a small portion of land and be given land ownership, which really would have rewritten American history in the fact that we would have radical land redistribution, but you would also have the very, very poor of the American South given a way to climb the economic and social ladders through land ownership. All right, and all they ask in exchange for this is just an oral allegiance to the United States and to the Constitution. Right. Okay. In addition to this act that gets passed, President Johnson approved something known as the Freedmen's Bureau, which is for 1 year. Like the Freedmen's Bureau is going to go out and they're going to try to transition the South from a slave labor economy to a wage labor economy. We're basically going to try to take the South, the farms, the plantations, away from a situation where they paid no labor costs whatsoever and create some sort of workable economy in which wages are paid, right? In addition to restructuring the economic structure of the South, they're going to start to provide education. They're going to build public schools. They're going to go in and they're going to set up community services where people can go in and try to be reconnected with loved ones that were lost, that were sold off during slavery, those types of things. And they're very, very successful. This is a very successful part of Reconstruction at this point. They go in, the book talks about the fact that they use like Christian ministry, missionary work blueprints. They go in and they're going into a third world country, like a developing country, and they're going to go in and this is how they're going to do that. Because if you look at the South, where they were economically after the war, there's no doubt that they were just absolutely devastated. This is just an economic wasteland, and it needs some help to get back on its feet. However, by 1866, Johnson believes that under Johnson's rule, the majority of the southern states had begun to work towards rejoining the Union, and Johnson feels like the work of reunion was basically complete, and he ends the Freedmen's Bureau, ends really federal intervention in what's going on in the South. Okay, and so as the African Americans and the former slaves, now the free slaves, start to benefit from their newfound freedoms, start to find their new freedom, start to work with freedmen's bureaus, start to get education, learn to read, learn to write, be reconnected with lost loved ones, start to form a sense of community. There's a real sense of danger in the South from the white aristocracy. Right? And so one of the things they're going to do, the book talks about, I'm sure that you guys are familiar with this from your high school history class, is the South is going to go through and they're going to pass a whole bunch of laws that are going to be known collectively as black codes that are going to are aimed at preventing freedoms from reaching African Americans. And the big one that the book talks about that I think you ought to focus on is the fact that it's going to limit economic opportunities to African Americans. First of all, the black codes pretty much uniformly are going to require African Americans to be able to show some form of employment. However, they're not going to allow African Americans to have multiple employers. All right, and so therefore, this whole idea about the American dream of going out and I'm going to work hard, right, and I'm going to get maybe 2 jobs, 3 jobs, I'm going to save a little money, I'm going to buy my own land, I'm going to move up. Well, that's not going to be available to the free slaves. You're going to work for one person only. You're going to accept the terms of their labor contract, and that's all the money that you're going to make. And therefore, you're going to stay at the bottom rung of society throughout time, right? And so really that black codes are going to work in direct opposition to this idea of the Freedmen's Bureau, which is going in there and trying to establish this idea of a wage-based labor economy, because you're dealing with, granted you're paying wages, but you're not allowing for free competition on the marketplace, right? And so you have a negative situation for the African Americans, right? The book talks about the powerful struggle between President Johnson and this new Republican Congress that's going to go on. You're going to see the Congress pass a Civil Rights Act of 1866 that's going to look to limit local power in the South, look to give African Americans more rights. Johnson's going to veto it. The Congress is going to override the veto, and then it becomes this big legal question of how is this law going to really be enforced, right? And so Congress is going to put together the 14th Amendment that is going to offer equal protection, both on the federal level and the state level, to all citizens, right? And then so like, what's a citizen? And we get into that issue, right? But Johnson's going to openly oppose this. Can you imagine that? Like a president actually openly opposing the constitutional amendment, right? So he goes out and he campaigns all over the country like, hey, don't ratify this amendment. Don't ratify this amendment. It's bad. It's bad. It's bad. And so you just create this wedge between Congress and the president, and Congress looks for ways to limit his power. One of the ways they're going to do that is in 1867, they're going to pass the Military Reconstruction Act, which is basically going to take Reconstruction out of the president's hands, right? Congress is going to take this over. Johnson, of course, vetoes it. Congress overrides it. And this is where we're going to enter into that period of congressional Reconstruction or radical Reconstruction. We're going to divide the South into 11 military districts. We're going to put a U.S. military general in charge of each district. Each district is going to have like 20,000 troops in it to enforce like election law, voting laws, the 14th Amendment, which is going to be ratified shortly thereafter, right? And so they're going to create new barriers and new hurdles for these states to join the Union. In order to rejoin the Union under this Military and Reconstruction Act, you're going to have states not only ratify the 14th Amendment, but they're also going to have to rewrite state constitutions. This whole power struggle between Congress and the president is going to end up with President Johnson being impeached. He's the first president in the United States history to be impeached. Actually, one of only two, right? One of only two. You have Johnson and you have President Clinton. Nixon was never really impeached. And so you have Johnson, who basically just openly defies a law that gets passed by Congress. Congress sets a trap for him, basically limits his ability to... They passed two laws. The first one limits his ability to issue military orders. The second one limits his ability to appoint or to dismiss officials within his own administration. And in August of 1867, he removes the Secretary of War, right, which is open violation of what was known as the Tenure of Office Act that was passed by Congress. And so Congress writes up papers of impeachment. They run it through the House of Representatives with like 14, 15 charges of wrongdoing against the president. He gets found guilty, not guilty. He gets found there's enough evidence to move forward. And impeachment works like this. The House of Representatives gathers information, they present it, they take a vote to decide if they're going to move forward to remove an elected official from office or not. After, if they get a favorable vote, 2/3 vote, then it goes into the Senate, and the Senate decides if they're going to remove somebody or not. Johnson is impeached, but he escapes removal from office by one vote. But after an impeachment, the president's power is basically just out the window, and Johnson's just riding this thing out until the end, right? So in 1868, we hold another presidential election. Johnson doesn't even run. U.S. Grant is the Republican nominee. He runs on the fact that, hey, I won the Civil War.